The history behind the glorious KV-2 has remained out of the direct spotlight, and today we are going to correct that. Why was this bizarre tank even created in such a way, and why was it the most feared tank on the Eastern Front, at least for a brief time? What was it like to be one of its crew members? You're going to see all of that in this video. Let's begin. Birth of a monster. The Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland in 1939 had revealed a glaring weakness in Soviet armor, their lack of firepower to smash through the heavily fortified Finnish Mannerheim line. The existing Kliment Voroshilov, better known as the KV-1 heavy tank, was very well armored for the time, but carried a relatively modest 76mm gun that just didn't have the punch needed to destroy concrete bunkers. Soviet military commanders demanded a solution, and they wanted it fast. Instead of developing a sensible self-propelled gun with a fixed casemate, which would come later in the war, they made perhaps the most Soviet engineering decision possible, probably after a bottle of vodka. Let's just stick a massive howitzer in an equally massive turret on top of our existing tank chassis. What could possibly go wrong? The design process was rushed, to say the least. In just 2 weeks, Soviet engineers designed a prototype turret capable of housing the colossal M10 152mm howitzer, as double the caliber would do the job. This everything but normal-looking turret was then placed on the KV chassis, creating what was initially called the KV Bolshaya Bashnya, meaning KV Big Turret. 4 KV prototypes would receive this monstrous turret, and rushed testing began. When your leader has a habit of making people who disappoint him disappear, you deliver what he wants on time, even if it's a mechanical monstrosity that would later become known by such colorful nicknames as the Soviet Fridge or Mobile Fortress. Upon arrival at the front in Finland, the prototype KV-2s were given to the 20th Heavy Tank Brigade for combat trials and showed remarkable results. In one instance, a KV reportedly received 22 hits without being knocked out of action. Finnish anti-tank guns actually stopped firing at the tanks after 3 non-damaging hits, partly due to the Finns' ammunition shortage, but mostly because their shells were simply doing little to nothing against Soviet monsters on tracks. The immense size and armor of these tanks earned them the nickname Dreadnought by their crews. On paper, the KV-2 was impressive, 75 to 110mm of armor protecting its crew from practically all anti-tank weapons of the time. And there wasn't much on the battlefield that could protect itself from a direct hit from a 152mm high-explosive howitzer shell. But the horrors for its crews began the moment you tried to actually use the thing as a, tank. First, there was the weight problem. The standard KV already tipped the scales at 45 tons and suffered from transmission issues. The KV-2, with its massive turret weighing 12 tons alone, ballooned to an excess of 53 tons. The Soviet engineers, in their infinite wisdom and under time pressure, decided not to upgrade the engine or transmission to handle this extra burden, causing immense strain on the turret ring on top of the stresses the engine and gearbox were already experiencing. The result was a tank with a theoretical top speed of 25 km per hour on roads and a pathetic 12 km per hour off-road, and that's assuming it didn't break down first. When your tank is more likely to be immobilized by its own mechanical failures than enemy fire, you know you're in trouble. But when we talk about the turret, it only gets worse. Following the initial success of the prototypes, an order of 100 KV-2s and 130 KV-1s was given. Although 20 pre-production turrets had already been produced, the final version of the KV-2 differed significantly from the pre-series tanks. To remedy some issues and simplify production, the turret was completely reworked, scrapping the previous angled MT-1 design for a new rolled plate which created a 6-sided turret with vertical walls called the MT-2. This created 2 distinctly different looks to the KV-2s. The newer turret featured the improved gun and a coaxial machine gun to replace the pistol ports from the MT-1. Despite these changes and a 2-ton weight reduction in the new design, it was still impossible to overcome the main weaknesses. The same electric motor for turret traverse was used in the now much heavier and unbalanced turret. A full 360-degree rotation took around 40 seconds using the electric traverse on ideally flat terrain. If that failed, crews had to use a manual traverse, and depending on the terrain, they might need up to 3 minutes to make a full circle. If the tank was tilted even slightly, on a hill or in a ditch, the massive turret needed much more time to turn or could even jam. The turret also had a tendency to turn on its own, hopefully without crushing anyone around the tank. The tank had to come to a complete stop before firing because the immense recoil from the gun could cause damage. An even bigger problem was the top-heavy design, making it extremely easy to flip over. Soviet tankers even said they feared slopes more than enemy tanks. But we'll get into how battles looked like from inside one of these. If you thought driving and aiming the KV-2 was bad, try being a loader inside its turret. I mean, one of the loaders. Shells weighed approximately 40 kilograms, 88 pounds, and had to be loaded in 2 separate pieces and by 2 loaders. The 20-kilogram projectile came from storage bins located in the hull beneath the turret, and they even had a ladder to reach the rounds and lift them into the gun's breech, ram it, and then load the propellant behind it. In theory, a reload rate of roughly 2 rounds per minute was possible, while in practice you'd sometimes need 2 or even 3 minutes to pull one shot off. Standing at a towering 12 feet tall, the KV-2's massive silhouette was impossible to miss on the battlefield. German tankers nicknamed it the Soviet fridge due to its boxy turret, though they weren't laughing when their shells bounced harmlessly off its thick armor. Early German guns were small caliber 37 and 50 mm, and for a brief period, only the 88 mm flat cannon could destroy Soviet heavy tanks effectively. German tanks tried to immobilize or outflank them with their superior mobility, while artillery or infantry would later finish them. It wasn't rare for a single Soviet tank to ruin the day for an entire German column until it ran out of ammo or broke down. However, everything that could go wrong with the KV-2 eventually did go wrong. During Operation Barbarossa, the majority of KV-2s were abandoned by their crews due to mechanical breakdowns or lack of fuel. By the end of its production cycle, a total of 204 KV-2s would be built. But adding to the horrors faced by KV-2 crews was the Soviet military leadership's interesting decision to classify these massive, impossible-to-hide tanks as secret weapons. Some units got tanks without ammunition, and most crews had only about 10 hours of training before being pushed into action. Even more, the KV-2 was never used as intended. The tank was designed as a slow-moving bunker buster, meant to slowly but surely advance, immune to anti-tank fire, aim at fortified positions, and make them not exist anymore, for which it was more than capable. However, it was instead thrown into desperate defensive combat against a well-organized and coordinated advancing German army. It was like using a sledgehammer to swat flies, technically powerful enough but hopelessly unsuited for the task. From time to time, in the right hands and in the right place, a single KV-2 could cause a headache for the army invading its country. As darkness fell on June 23, 1941, locals near Rasenii, Lithuania, watched a battered Soviet tank lumber into position on a crucial supply road. The tank simply stopped there and shut its engine. The civilians figured the crew had abandoned their broken down or out-of-fuel tank during the night. As for the whole next day, no one was seen around it. The German 6th Panzer Division was advancing through the region and was expected to come up the road at any moment. German reconnaissance spotted a massive Soviet tank parked by the road, probably broken down and abandoned, nothing too unusual. No one was seen near it, and a German convoy continued driving past. But at one moment, it seemed like the turret of this abandoned tank started to slowly turn. Maybe just an optical illusion from a distance, until the massive gun fired, directly hitting the convoy, and 12 German trucks began burning. The Germans scattered in panic as the tank fired at everything that moved, quickly organizing and bringing up 450mm anti-tank guns. They opened fire on the tank that was just standing there, firing as fast as it could, but their shells bounced off. Orders came to quickly bring the 88 to deal with this nonsense, and soon it arrived. The 6-man Soviet crew inside the KV-2 watched as the gun was wheeled into position, waiting with nerves of steel while its crew prepared it for firing. They waited for the perfect moment for them to come close and stop, then fired a single high-explosive shell directly hitting the cannon and obliterating it before it could fire. The heavy fight resumed during the day. By nightfall, the Germans had thrown everything they had at this tank, from infantry to tank assaults, and they were all somehow repelled. The single KV-2 and its 6-man crew were holding up an entire panzer division, fighting off wave after wave of German attacks. When the night fell, a group of sappers crept up to the tank with explosives, but they also failed to destroy it. By morning, the Germans, now furious, changed tactics. A column of panzers moved forward as a distraction, while infantry tried to sneak behind the Soviet tank. As its turret turned towards the panzers, German soldiers managed to toss grenades through the vision ports. An explosion followed, and then silence. When the Germans inspected the smoldering wreck, they found the remains of all 6 crewmen. German Colonel Raus was so impressed by the bravery of this insane crew that he ordered them buried with full military honors, but their names remain unknown. Production of the KV-2 had already ceased in October 1941, with Soviet factories being relocated eastward to escape the German advance. By the end of the same year, nearly all KV-2s in Soviet service had been abandoned, destroyed, or captured. The design lessons learned from the KV-2's numerous flaws weren't wasted, however. Later, Soviet self-propelled guns like the Su-152 were significantly more practical and effective, with the same caliber but an improved gun. Only one working KV-2 survives today. So the next time you see that iconic silhouette of the Soviet fridge, remember its legendary story and the people inside it.